We want to take the next few minutes to look at some thoughts from the portions that we read from the Torah. By the way, the word Torah means what? Teaching. It means teaching. It's oftentimes translated as law in your English Bibles, but it actually means teaching. It's from a root word in Hebrew meaning to point out. It's also used of an archer, when an archer sends an arrow to the target. So it means to hit the target, or to point out what is right as opposed to what is wrong. And that's what Torah means. It means God's teaching and righteousness. It's amazing to me, and I have talked face to face with numbers of scholars that I highly appreciate and respect. They are men, and in some cases women, who have studied the Scriptures, have shown themselves faithful in their own lives, and know the Word of God very well. And on occasion, I've had the opportunity to sit and eat a lunch or dinner or something at one of the annual meetings that we go to, and ask them just theological questions. And one of the questions that I've asked is, do you teach that the law has been abolished? And then there's this kind of hemming and hawing. And the answer ultimately is yes, but with some provisions, etc., etc. And I have been astonished to read scholars who simply come out and say that when Yeshua died on the cross, he abolished the law. Have you heard that? I've also heard from similar sources something like what you have at the beginning of your notes. The law is concerned with externals. The Spirit is concerned with the heart. We often hear this, but if you study the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Torah could be viewed as the whole Bible, but let's just for a moment put it to the first 5 books, the books of Moses. When we read the books of Moses, do we find things that talk about our inward relationship with God, our heart, and by the way, when we say heart, we're talking about what? That's where we do our thinking, right? In a Hebrew perspective, you think right here, okay? Where do you feel all your emotions? Down here in there. Yeah, in fact, it's always amazing when you first start studying Greek and Hebrew, and I remember in college when I was taking Greek, we were reading certain portions of Paul, and it says that Paul says, "I love you with all of my kidneys." And you're thinking, no, that has to be wrong. I must have the wrong word. And you look it up in the lexicon, and sure enough, that's what it says. I love you with all of my kidneys. But that was just because in that culture, where you felt your emotions was oftentimes in your stomach, in that area of, because when you're upset, when you're scared, your stomach seizes up, And so when we talk about loving God with all of our heart, what does that mean? Loving God with all of our intentions, with all of our decisions, with everything that we think and consider to be right and wrong. And so this is why the psalmist says the Torah of the Lord is perfect. It's not missing anything. Everything is there that you need. It's not deficient. But he goes on to use all these other words. Do you remember that? That's in 19 of Psalms. Just while I bring that to my mind. It says, the Torah of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony, that's just a synonym for Torah. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. You see how perfect and pure and right and sure are all kind of synonyms. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true, they are righteous altogether. Those are all synonyms for Torah. The teaching of the Lord. It says they are more desirable than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey, and the drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them the servant is warned, in keeping them there is great reward. So sometimes, people characterize those of us who have gained a new appreciation for the Torah as though, well, we're off in some kind of peripheral thing here, and maybe we're not making very good sense with regard to putting emphasis upon the Torah. So I just want to remind us all that when we talk about the Torah, we're talking about the entire teaching of God, not just one part or another part. We don't believe that the so-called, what is oftentimes called the New Testament, trumps the Old Testament, or that the Old Testament trumps the New Testament. We believe that the whole Bible, all 66 books, are the inspired Word of God, and therefore all the Scriptures are profitable, right? For teaching, correction, instruction, so forth and so on. So that the person of God might be adequate. Now, adequate is kind of a bad word, but in English, because adequate just means so-so, right? Adequate means C. We want A, right? A minus is okay, B plus, okay, but we, no, but it means able to accomplish all that is necessary. That's what the word means. So that the person who knows the Lord, who is a child of God, would be able to approach every aspect of life in a way that is appropriate, God-honoring, and good for us. That's why we study this. That's why we read it and talk about it. When we study the Torah itself, we see repeatedly that this perspective of the Torah, the law is only external and not internal, is entirely unfounded. In fact, just the opposite is true. In the Torah, God continually calls His people to live out their obedience to Him on the basis of their faith. You say, well, Tim, where do you get that from our portion today? I'm glad you asked the question. Our Torah reading today is a case in point. Having given the laws regarding the release of debts at the sabbatical year. Remember, every 7 years, according when Israel was living in the land and where they were supposed to be, then every 7 years they had to release debts. Which means what? Which means bankers couldn't become moguls and own everything. It kind of leveled out the person that can just all of a sudden own so much and put everybody impoverished. No, at the end of 7 years, he had to say, okay, we starting at zero. Your debts are gone. So Moses goes on to warn the Israelites about the natural tendency to withdraw one's helping hand toward his impoverished neighbor as the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, approaches. This, of course, would be the natural way of thinking of things. If I loan money to my neighbor too near to the coming Shemitah year, he won't have time to repay the debt, and then the remainder of what he owes will be canceled at the sabbatical year. In other words, loaning money to my neighbor just before the Shemitah year means that in essence I'll be giving him a major portion of the loan. This being the case, it would be the natural tendency to harden one's heart, literally strengthen one's heart, and to close off one's hand in regard to one's neighbor. Now, this is talking about a neighbor. It's not talking necessarily about the guy or the gal that's standing next to the freeway with a sign saying, don't have enough food, please give me money. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have compassion upon people who are in need, even if we don't know them. But we need to use wisdom. Very quick illustration. Years ago, when I had my office down on Portland Avenue, and there was a lot of people down there that were using drugs and so forth and so on, I regularly had people come to the office asking if we could help this person with just a little bit of money for food. I said, well, and I knew better, but sometimes I make stupid decisions. And I opened my wallet and I gave it was a gal, I gave her a $10 bill or whatever. And about a half hour later, I realized that I needed to go get gas in my car because I had to drive up to Seattle and I didn't have enough gas in the car and I wanted to get gas before I had to leave. So I went to the gas station. And you know who was just ahead of me at the pump? This gal. And you know what she was driving? A brand new car. Boy, I should have gone to Proverbs, huh? And I felt taken. I felt stupid. I felt like that was really dumb. Why didn't I ask a few questions, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so we learn our lessons when we sometimes make mistakes. Yeah, and what Carol's saying is there's a whole lot of scenarios that could be painted that would help her get out of a situation that she said she was in. And, that's a wise thing to do. Have those well at hand and say, well, let me call, let me call Carol. No. So let's put this, our text in context. It's talking about your brother. It's talking about someone you know. It's someone within your community. Okay? Now, we don't have a Shemitah year, do we? But what's the bottom line of this? Oh, I should back up and explain what I just said. Contrary to what others may have been teaching on the internet, I won't use any names, the Shemitah year, the year of release, is only in the land of Israel. It's not anywhere else. God is not punishing America because we don't keep the sabbatical year. Okay, He never told us to keep the sabbatical year. So, in the context of what's happening here, in our Torah portion, it's saying within your community. Now let's apply that to our own communities, our own families, right? Family is a community. It's the first unit of community. When we know that someone in our community or in our family is in need, even if they've made bad decisions or poor decisions, but they're in real honest need and we verify that, we should not have a hardened heart saying, well, you could have worked more hours. No, we should help them get out of the situation they're in and then help them so they don't get back into that situation, right? We have that opportunity in community. We're not to withhold our hand. He said, you shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing Adonai your God will bless you in all your work and in all your hardship. When we're willing to follow the Lord and the leading of the Spirit in wisdom, we can trust God to meet our needs. What then is the basis for obeying the command to give generously to the one in need? It is a reliance upon the Word of God that what He has said He will do. What is that called? Faith. Right? This Torah immediately calls you to live by faith. Say, okay, I'm going to trust the Lord is telling me the truth, because I know He is, and He's going to supply my needs. And if I don't have all that I feel I should have, He's going to supply my needs. I'm not going to withhold my heart and my hand from my brother. In other words, obedience flows out of faith in God. For in loaning money to the poor that one knows will not be returned because the sabbatical year is too close, one is cast upon God's provisions, His promise to bless in ways unthinkable by the natural mind. Yet there appears to be an inconsistency regarding the poor. In chapter 15, verse 4, it is stated, there will be no poor among you, since Adonai will surely bless you in the land which Adonai your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess. While in verses 7 and 11, the presence of the poor within the Israelite society is not only presumed, but even promised. The poor is always going to be with you. How are we to reconcile this apparent contradiction? Several options have been suggested. Some modern scholars simply consider verses 4 to 6 not being in the Bible. That's the easiest way. You know, the easiest way is when let me use an analogy of fishing. I don't get to fish very often anymore. I don't know why, but I used to like to fish, and I had a friend who had a boat, and we'd go out fishing. And for me, the most enjoyable kind of fishing is fly fishing. Any of you done fly fishing? Okay. Have you ever had 4 people in a boat fly fishing at the same time? I have. You know, one out the back, one out the front, and 2 out the sides. But you're doing this. Now, what's the inevitability? You're going to get all tangled up. There's 2 ways to get that taken care of. To sit down in the boat and carefully untangle your lines, or to cut the lines. Right. There are a lot of people, when they can't find how the Bible works together, when they find something that seems to contradict, they say, well, let's just cut that out. Let's say, well, that wasn't really in there. You know, that somebody added that later. No, that's not the right thing to do. That's what a lot of modern, shall we say, liberal scholars want to do. Another option is that verse 4 states the ideal. If Israel were completely obedient, there wouldn't be any poverty. But Moses, knowing that Israel will in fact disobey, gives the laws pertaining to the poor, who will, because of Israel's disobedience, inevitably remain. But neither of these are satisfying. Neither of these options are satisfying. There's no reason to doubt the genuine character of the verses. They're in all the manuscripts. Moreover, without withholding one's hand from the poor is stated to be a sin in verse 9, and giving generously to the poor brings God's blessings. One can hardly argue that God's blessings will come if the very presence of the poor is the result of disobedience. Furthermore, to think that providing for the poor would eventually eradicate all poverty does not take into account the foreigners who would constantly be joining Israel and might themselves be impoverished. By the way, we have that situation here in our region, all right? Washington is known as having as many handouts for homeless people and whatever as any other state in the Union. And so what do we have? Up in Seattle particularly, and Tacoma, We have a lot of people coming from other states to become homeless people here.
Because they get lots of service.
They get lots of service, right. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some who are genuinely homeless and need help. I'm not making that accusation. But I know that there are many who are homeless because they are addicted to drugs and they cannot move away from that addiction. They need help from others to do that. So, more probable is the explanation that verse 4 deals with specific individual cases, while verse 7 and 11 state a general truth relative to a nation as a whole. Why do we have poverty even amongst believing communities? It is because we live in a fallen world. Sometimes things happen that one is not in control of, right? And can put someone into a state of poverty.
Okay, so slightly off topic, but in the same verse. So I was talking with one of my sons the other day about slavery in the Bible and such, and this is one of the verses that I was thinking of. But the question I have is where it has, you put the awl through the door and you have that slave become a perpetual slave at that point because they enjoy being with that master. Is that trumped by the Jubilee, or is that one of those situations where that trumps the Jubilee?
It's a good question, and there's not a very solid answer to it, but it would appear as though since the person has done it of their own accord, that they remain with that master. There is the very possibility that the master, being kind, would be willing to give that person freedom if something comes up where they're able to do that. Yeah,
After that,
right.
Yeah, so I'm good.
It's there to tell us that the relationship between the servant and the master was a good relationship, not one that in fact one wanted to stay in that relationship. Okay, it should be noted how the matter of helping poor from a Torah perspective is the responsibility of the individual, not that of Israel's government. Have you noticed that? I don't want to belabor this. We're a little bit late. But there's nothing that says the nation is to take care of the poor in the Bible. It never said to the king, you must set aside so much money, you must da-da-da-da-da. It never said, to the governors of cities and so forth, you should take care of the poor. The poor were always taken care of by individuals, which is one of the reasons that they're in later, much more modern Judaisms, I would say in the Middle Ages and later, where we read the rabbinic materials, there were those Gentiles who are called Gentiles, or who are called proselytes, that's the wrong term actually, converts of the stomach. People that were poor said, oh, what if you convert to being part of this synagogue community over here, then they're obligated to take care of you. And so, good, I'll convert, doesn't matter to me, as long as I get to eat, right? No, the Torah never says that it's the responsibility of a government or a nation or to take care of the poor. Who does the responsibility rest upon? Individuals. If the individuals were living in accordance with what God said, the poor would be taken care of. Right? Isn't that what our Torah portion says? Don't withhold your hand. Be ready to give. You say, well, what about those of the nations that aren't part of your community? Well, the Torah is given to this community of God's chosen people, Israel, right? And obviously those who join Israel through the grafting in of faith in the Messiah, then we are to care for each other. Well, how are we to apply this commandment to be open-hearted and open-handed to the poor? We are carefully to maintain those who are in need within our own community. One thing, and I would extend that to our family, even if family aren't part of our faith community, one thing that will greatly diminish our testimony of God's greatness is if there are those within our community who, in honest need, are left unaided. Conversely, when the watching world sees that we carefully and regularly help the needy within our community, they will see the reality of God's having blessed us as He said He would. Our text goes on to specify how much soft-hearted and open-handed response to those in poverty is applied to the release of Hebrew slaves and servants. That is, these laws do not apply to foreign slaves or servants. In the year of release, Household slaves and servants were to be released and given their freedom. Slavery in the ancient Near East, and specifically in the Israelite community, may have occurred for a number of reasons. We, obviously, and for right reasons, we have a very negative view of slavery here in the United States of America, and rightly so. Slavery in the U.S. and in other parts of the world was atrocious. People were treated as though they were not even people, right? So when we sometimes read the Bible, we say, well, wait a minute, the Bible says it's okay to have a slave. The Torah gives us specific laws about how slaves are to be treated, right? If a master were to injure a slave, knock a tooth out, something to that effect, the slave went free. There was to be a mutual kind of respect for the fact that both the master and the slave were created in God's image. And this is why we have some who said, I don't want to leave. I want to stay with you. It was a whole different approach to things. Now, were there those who maybe didn't follow what the Torah said? I'm sure there were. But then the community as a whole should have held them to what the Torah says. Why was there slavery at all in, or shall we say servanthood in Israel? It had to do with debt. If you got into debt and you couldn't pay your debt, then you were in big trouble. How could you do it? You could say, I'll work for you. You give me food to eat, and all of my work, which you normally would pay me to do, will go against what I owe. Now, another person in your family could redeem you, right? You come in and say, okay, how much does he owe now? He's worked for 4 years. How much does he owe? He owes X amount. Okay, I'll give it to you. He goes free. So it was voluntary work in order to pay off your debt. That was primarily what was going on in the ancient world. So if one borrows money in order to obtain what one cannot himself afford, then one is presuming that he or she will be able to repay this debt in the coming months and years. This is why borrowing is frowned upon, or at least is warned against in the Scriptures. Such a presumption is based upon the idea that one will be able to work in the future and maintain an income out of which the debt can be repaid. But who knows what the future holds? Only the Almighty has such knowledge. The one who borrows may fall ill or incur an injury, and thus be unable to work and repay the debt. Wisdom tells us the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Proverbs 22:7. This does not mean that borrowing is forbidden, or that it constitutes a sin. What it does teach us is that borrowing may lead to enslavement, and this was surely a reality in ancient Israel. Even in more modern societies, debtors' prisons were populated by those unable or unwilling to repay their debts. There was no automatic bankruptcy, as is the case in our current society. If one were unable to pay a debt, he was obligated to enslave himself to the debtor until the year of release arrived. In ancient Israel, when the year of release did come, the household slave or servant was not only to be released, but was also to be supplied amply with those provisions needed for him or her to return to normal living. We read it in our chapter, verses 13 through 14, chapter 15 of Deuteronomy. When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock, and from your threshing floor, and from your wine vat. You will give to him as Adonai your God has blessed you. Do you see how the Torah requires a generous heart? That's why. And why? Because God has shown his generosity to us. When we really come to understand that every good thing we have comes from him, it gives us a heart willing to give to others. It's based on two things. First, one is to remember the enslavement of Israel in Egypt and how wonderful it is to be free as a result of God's gracious redemption. Redemption is freedom from slavery, right? So, we're not slaves anymore, right? Oh, we're redeemed from slavery of Egypt to become what? Slaves of righteousness. And in fact, I can make this a little shorter. That's exactly why our text is telling us, reminding us in Deuteronomy, we've already read it in Exodus and in Numbers and Leviticus in some cases. Why does God tie Passover with the feast of Pentecost or Shavuot? How does it, by the way, how does he do that? He ties it together how? Yeah, you're supposed to start counting 50 days, and then you find out when to celebrate Pentecost. Pentecost means 50, a count of 50, right? Pentecost. Okay, so why does he do that? He doesn't do that with Pentecost and Rosh Hashanah or, any of the other festivals. Why does he connect Passover with Shavuot? Here's why. Very simple. We were redeemed from Egypt. For what reason? He says to Moses, "Go tell Pharaoh, send forth my people that they may..." And it's the word serve or worship. We weren't redeemed so we could just do whatever we jolly well wanted to do. Right? That would be bad. We were redeemed to serve Him. That's why he ties the two together. So this whole idea of being redeemed and being a slave is at the very basis of what it means to have been saved by God's grace and brought into His family. Now, is serving Him a big chore? No, it's a delight. Why? Because as we serve Him, He blesses us. He says, "Okay, I want you to do this." And you say, "But Father, I don't have this and this and this, and I need that before I can do what you tell me to do." He says, "No problem. I've got everything you need. I'll give it to you." Freely you have received, freely give. Right? Matthew 10:8. So that's one of the first reasons why we should have an open heart and an open hand. Second, one is to remember that a slave's labor is worth double that of a hired hand. That is, he does the same work as a hired hand without receiving any wages, and a hired hand was most likely paid double what the cost of room and board was for the slave or servant. In other words, not only does the hired hand get his wages, but he probably also was provided a place to live. The hired hand would work only limited hours each day, while the slave or servant was available for work the entire 6 days each week, from sun up till sundown. Thus, at the time of remission, the owner is not to begrudge the necessity to provide ample provision to the freed slave or servant. Instead, he should recognize the financial advantage that has been given him, that has been his for the past 6 years. Once again, the day-to-day life of Torah obedience is based upon faith in God, faith that He would provide and bless as He promised. Rather than diminishing his material wealth, the owner who was generous to his released slave or servant could count on God's continuing blessings. Oh, we have so much more that we could say from this portion, but I don't want to have you sit here all day. Yes, question? So again, I think you bring that to our attention. The lesson that we learned, the application is that, number one, we should be open-hearted and open-handed to those who are in need, right, within our community, within our families. And the other is that we should be very careful about getting into a situation where we are a bondservant to a bank card or something else. In other words, remember that in some cases we're going to borrow money to buy a house, to buy whatever, but we ought to do that with wisdom, and we ought to do that with counsel, so that we know that given the best case scenario, we will be able to pay this off in short order and be no longer under that debt. So yeah, those are all good lessons. Yeah. So if you turn to page 5, and by the way, in the afternoon session, if any of you have questions about the things that we've done that I haven't covered, we can go over that too, Michael. We don't understand that so much in our modern day, but in not too far back, in countries that had a king or a queen, okay, you were very careful about what you said about the king or the queen, because it could be your head if you said the wrong thing, right? In other words, that person had ultimate power. But that person also had the ability to make things right and good. And we have a tendency to think that freedom is the ability to do anything we want. But what is true freedom? The ability to do what God wants us to do. That's true freedom. Right? Because when we were slaves to sin, we couldn't do what God wanted. We were not free. Being free to love God and to follow His commandments is truly freedom. So if we go to page 5 and kind of the second paragraph down, here in the Torah we find the background for the biblical teaching for redemption of slaves to sin and the willing servanthood to the slaves of righteousness. For throughout our text, our Parashah, the backdrop of the Exodus itself is evident as the motivation for Israel's obedience to God. Having been redeemed from the house of slavery in Egypt, Israel has become servants of the Almighty. Yet this servitude to God is not something imposed or forced. Rather, like the indentured slave who recognizes how good it is to have become part of his master's household, so we have come to acknowledge the blessings of being members of the household of God. And that's exactly what the apostles say. We have become children in the household of God. We have willingly put our ear to the door. Now, I know I'm playing a little game there, but the indentured slave, he was to put his ear to the door. Why? Why not his hand? Why not his thumb? Why the ear? It's because, in a biblical viewpoint, obedience is attached to the ear. Yeah. When it says Shema Israel, it means obey. But it's literally the word to hear, right? Then why is it pierced against the doorpost? The doorpost, the door was viewed as kind of a symbol of your whole life. When you come in, when you go out. So you pass through the door, and all of your life is kind of going in and out of that door. Therefore, it's a testimony of your life. This is why, what were we also supposed to put on the doorpost? The blood coming out of Egypt, but also it says, write these things on the doorpost. Write these words on the doorpost of your house and upon your gates. Why? So that you remember them when you go in and when you go out. It's a testimony of your whole life. Can you imagine an indentured slave might go out and look at the doorpost and there's a hole, maybe with still a little bit of red blood in there or something? Say, yeah, that's proof. That's proof of who I am. Right? Now, can I make an illustration? I'm not saying the scriptures teach this. I'm not pounding the pulpit on this. But why did Yeshua say he was the door? We always think of it as just a way in or a way out, but I think it's more than that. It is the way in. I am the door. Anyone who comes by me will come in, and I will eat with him and he with me, right? Okay? But it's more than just an opening or an entrance. It's a testimony of who you are. And so I can say, we have willingly put our ear to the door and identified with his having been pierced. Indeed, it is our own impoverishment that caused the piercing of the door itself. It is in so identifying with Yeshua in his death, we have become his servants forever, slaves of righteousness, as Paul puts it. Okay. One more thing that I just want to point out and ask you if you have an answer for it. I'd like to engage you in this. In chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, at the beginning, it talks about observing Passover in the month of Aviv. Aviv was the time when the barley became ripe. Okay, and that's what Aviv means, the ripened head of the barley. You shall celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Aviv the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and from the herd. How many of you ever heard of a Passover cow? Remember, the flock means sheep or goats, right? The herd means bovine, bulls, cows, etc. Did they bring a Passover bull? I thought it was a lamb. In fact, it says in Exodus 12, you shall take a lamb from the flock. So, does Deuteronomy and Exodus disagree? I would suggest to you that this is the answer to the major conflict which goes on. We talk about it every Passover. We've studied it before, right? It sounds like John's account of the crucifixion is at variance with the accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay? Do you remember it? Let me briefly remind you. It says that Yeshua was in the garden with his disciples, right? And they came with torches, so it was still dark. Very early in the morning they took him, and now, had they already eaten the Passover by this time? Yeah, Yeshua and his disciples had the Passover, right? So they took him and they inquired of Caiaphas, then they brought him to the praetorium, right? And they brought him to Pilate and so forth and so on. And it says in the text of John, only in John, that some of them did not want to enter the praetorium for fear of becoming unclean because they wanted to eat the Passover. And so you have all of these different saying, well, what Yeshua and his disciples ate was not a Passover meal, it was some kind of fellowship meal. Well, guess what? According to Deuteronomy 16, verse 2, the Passover includes not only the lamb that was given on the evening of the 14th, the beginning of the 15th, but it also included all of the sacrifices that would be given for the 7 days. Now, some of those sacrifices were clearly sacrifices that could be eaten, meat could be eaten from it and shared with those who brought it, right? So when you brought, does the Torah say that they're supposed to sacrifice from the herd every day? Yes. Bull, right? And were the priests able to share some of that meat? Yes. And it appears as though in John he's talking about those from the priestly line who didn't want to go in because they didn't want to become unclean. If you were unclean, ceremonially unclean by being in a place where someone had been executed, how long were you? 7 days, and you were clean on the 8th day. They would have lost out everything of the week, right? And not only that, this was how some of the priests made their living. I mean, there was a lot of sacrifices that came in at Passover. So you would get hides, you would get meat, you would get, and you say, well, could they preserve meat in ancient times? Sure. What would they do? Salt, yeah. So a good portion of a priestly due or income came at these festivals. It makes perfect sense if you read the Torah at the same time you're reading the Gospels. So read the whole Bible. It works.